What happens when a fiery young press secretary confronts a world-famous comedian live on national TV, and then the screen goes black? In a broadcast that was supposed to entertain America witnessed something far deeper. Accusations, leaked documents, a hidden video, and a feed that mysteriously cut just seconds before the truth was revealed. Was it censorship or protection? As the internet exploded and the audience took sides, one question remained. Who is afraid of what being exposed? Stay with us because this isn't just a story about two people. It's about the battle for truth in the country we all love. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the audience. The studio wasn't dressed for entertainment tonight, it was prepared for battle. A single spotlight ignited at center stage, casting long shadows across the polished floor. From behind the velvet curtain, the deep, measured voice of veteran host Jack Harper echoed like the roll of distant thunder. Two of America's most divided voices. One stage. No script, no edits. The words hit like a bell toll. This wasn't just a debate, it was a collision. Karoline Leavitt stepped out first. The youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, she wore her signature steel blue blazer and carried the same defiant look she's worn since the first press room ambush. Her steps were sharp, deliberate, confident. But there was something else in her eyes: control. Cold control. No smile, no glance to the crowd, just laser focus. Then came Trevor Noah. The audience stirred. A ripple of polite applause moved through the rows, mostly from the Team Trevor side, those wearing t-shirts with his grinning face. He emerged slowly, hands in his pockets, flashing that familiar smirk. But the camera didn't lie. Behind the grin was calculation. His eyes, usually quick with laughter, scanned Karoline with quiet caution. This wasn't The Daily Show. This wasn't a campaign rally. This was American Spotlight, a nationally syndicated live program where no one gets a second take. And the mood, not just tense, electric. The camera panned across the crowd. On one side, MAGA hats and veterans holding small American flags. On the other, students, comedians, urban professionals, eyes, sharp phones, raised. There were no neutral faces, no undecideds, just two Americas in one room. Jack Harper stood between them like a referee in a prize fight. Not a man to show nerves, but even his voice carried a slight edge as he welcomed viewers. Tonight we don't offer comfort, we offer confrontation. As Karoline and Trevor each took their seats, the distance between them felt like a political fault line. You could sense the weight of what hadn't been said yet. The audience didn't fidget. No chatter. They felt it coming. This wasn't going to be polite. It wasn't going to be predictable. Just before Harper tossed his first question, the studio fell into complete silence. No music, no applause sign, just tension. Two chairs, two lights, one truth, and millions watching, waiting for the first crack in the surface. The silence didn't last long. Trevor Noah was the first to speak, his voice calm, casual, laced with the kind of humor that's made him a household name across late-night television. You know, he said, leaning slightly toward the mic, I come from a place where telling the truth could make you disappear. I don't take platforms like this for granted. A polite chuckle rippled through the audience, mostly his side. It was classic Trevor, disarming, witty, with just enough weight behind the words to remind everyone he wasn't just a comedian. He was a survivor. A thinker, a man who'd earned his place. Karoline Leavitt didn't laugh. She nodded once, hands folded neatly on the table, her tone steady but firm as she responded. And I come from a place, she said without flinching, where people still believe in honor and truth that doesn't have to hide behind punchlines. We don't laugh to forget lies, we confront them. The reaction was instant. A low, tense murmur swept across the studio. Some clapped, others shifted in their seats. The air had changed. Whatever illusion of a civil dialogue remained. It cracked. Trevor's eyebrows rose just a hint. His smile faded an inch. Jack Harper, sensing the temperature rising, leaned in slightly but held his tongue. He knew better than to interrupt. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was positioning. This was war waged in words. Trevor chuckled again, but this time it was tighter, a little more forced. "I see where we're headed," he said. "But I'll say this. I've always believed the best way to reveal a lie is with laughter. The truth sticks better when people don't see it coming." Karoline didn't blink. "And I believe some lies are dressed up in laughter," she countered. "Softened just enough so the truth never reaches the heart. That's not comedy, Trevor. That's camouflage." Gasps. Then silence. A man in the crowd whispered, "She came loaded." Another muttered, "That was cold." The tension wasn't coming from shouting or name-calling. No, it was the precision. These were not off-the-cuff jabs. Every word was measured like a blade dipped in civility, but designed to cut. Trevor leaned back, lips tight. For the first time, his gaze drifted not to Karoline, not to Jack, but to the camera. He wasn't losing. But he was realizing something: she wasn't here to play his game. She came to rewrite the rules. The audience, older and sharply tuned, could feel it. This wasn't a yelling match. It was a chessboard with live microphones. The kind of exchange that doesn't make you cheer, it makes you lean in. No one left their seat. No one looked away, because they knew whatever came next wasn't going to be nice. The moment had been simmering since the first exchange. Now the temperature spiked. Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply reached to her right, lifted a slim folder and slid it gently across the table toward Trevor Noah. It made a soft thump on the wood, barely audible, but it landed like a gavel. She didn't look at the paper. She looked at Trevor. "Email from your production team," she said. Voice smooth as glass, but sharp as ice. Dated September 17th, 2020. And I quote, "Let's ramp up anti-Trump content, more aggressive, more frequent. We've got to keep the younger audience engaged." The room went dead still. You could hear the click of a pen 2 rows back. Jack Harper didn't speak. The camera zoomed in first on the folder, then tighter on Trevor's face. His eyes held steady, but his fingers betrayed him tapping the table in a steady rhythm, then pausing. A slight shift, but enough to be noticed. The mega side of the audience stirred low murmurs, some hushed clapping. A Vietnam vet in the front row nodded slowly, arms crossed. On the other side, Trevor's supporters leaned forward, phones out, recording every second. Harper finally broke the silence. "Trevor," he said, turning with a practiced neutral tone. "Do you want to respond to that?" Trevor smiled. Not wide, just enough to show he wasn't rattled. "Not yet. If I wrote emails about keeping our show alive in a chaotic year," he said, "then I suppose Karoline's writing textbooks for the MAGA doctrine. Come on. We both speak to our audience. We both play the game." Some chuckles. But they didn't last long. Karoline didn't let the moment slip. She kept her hands folded, her tone steady. "Trevor, this isn't a game," she said. "This was never about jokes. This was strategy. Your own team said so. Comedy with a mission. Target the same man over and over again, not because of truth, but because it kept the clicks rolling." Trevor leaned in slightly. "So, what are you suggesting? That comedy's now a federal offense?" "No," Karoline shot back. "But laundering political messaging through jokes, that's a betrayal of trust. Americans tune in to laugh, not to be nudged slowly into one world view." A wave of swept the older half of the crowd. They weren't cheering. They were thinking. Trevor exhaled. His fingers drummed again, faster now. "You've got a line in an email," he said. "A sentence. Out of context. From 3 years ago. and suddenly you're Sherlock Holmes with a flag pin. Karoline raised her brow just slightly. If it's so harmless, why does it make you sweat? And that was it. The crowd gasped, not at the words, but at the shift. This wasn't just rhetorical fencing anymore. This was a strike, a precise, calculated blow. Jack Harper straightened in his seat, sensing the moment needed framing. Karoline, you're saying this email represents a pattern, a political operation. She didn't blink. Yes, Jack. And this email is just the beginning. Trevor leaned back, crossed his arms, his smile gone. And just like that, the first crack appeared in the armor. The battle had turned. The folder sat untouched between them, the email still lingering like smoke in the air. But Trevor Noah wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. His expression shifted. No more smirks, no half-laughs. He straightened up, leaned into the mic, and spoke with clarity that cut through the room like a bell at dawn. If we're digging into each other's pasts, he said coolly, I think it's only fair we play this both ways. Without warning, a video clip appeared on the screen behind them. Grainy footage. Dated March 2019. Karoline Leavitt, then a communications aide for a well-known Republican congressman, stood at a press podium. The congressman beside her, later investigated for ethics violations involving campaign funds, was smiling for the cameras. Trevor didn't narrate. He didn't have to. The implication was clear. The clip ended and Trevor folded his hands slowly. I didn't hear anyone speaking truth to power back then. Not from that stage. Not from you, he said, eyes locked on Karoline. Maybe truth wasn't convenient at the time. The crowd stirred again. Whispers, frowns, subtle glances. Some shifted in their seats. This wasn't a one-sided takedown anymore. Trevor had found his angle and he was pressing hard. Karoline's face didn't twitch. She didn't glance away or try to dismiss the moment. Instead, she turned toward the audience. Her voice, when she spoke, didn't waver. I didn't speak, then she said evenly. And that silence still weighs on me. The room quieted. But I'm speaking now, she continued, not with jokes or applause lines, but with accountability. You don't need to agree with my politics to understand the power of choosing courage, even if it comes late. That landed. Several audience members nodded, especially those in the front rows, veterans and older Americans who had seen more than a few political twists in their lifetime. They knew remorse when it was real. They also knew the difference between a jab and a confession. Trevor wasn't done. So, you're saying silence back then was a mistake, he pressed. But calling me a manipulator now, that's justice. Karoline kept her eyes on him. No, it's truth catching up. For both of us. Jack Harper, sitting between them like a man moderating history itself, leaned forward. This just turned into something deeper than a debate, he said. What we're witnessing now, it's not just politics. It's personal. The audience could feel it. This was no longer about MAGA versus mainstream media. It was about two people, two worldviews, two stories, clashing not just with facts, but with flaws. The tension didn't drop, it evolved. From fire to focus, from attack to reflection. It wasn't who shouted louder. It was who stood taller when the shadows of the past showed up under the lights. And both were still standing. But only one had more left to reveal. The air was already razor-thin tension layered over tension like steel cables ready to snap. Trevor's clip from Karoline's past had rattled the foundation, but she hadn't fallen. Instead, she stood her ground, and now it was her turn to strike back harder. Karoline leaned forward, her voice calm, but with a glint of fire. I didn't just bring paperwork, she said, eyes fixed on Trevor. I have video footage from behind the scenes at The Daily Show. Gasps rippled across the studio. The words hung heavier than anything said yet. It wasn't a claim. It was a warning. Trevor froze, not visibly, not dramatically, but if you knew him, you saw it. The shift in his shoulders, the stillness in his eyes. For a man who made a living performing the pause said more than any punchline. He didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. His voice, when it came, was clipped and tense. You're threatening to air private material on live television. That's not truth, Karoline. That's a violation. Harper looked to Karoline. Is this real? He asked, his voice slower now, anchoring the moment. Karoline's reply came without delay. It's his voice, she said. Recorded in a production meeting. He said, and I quote, "Target Trump. That's how we keep the show alive." The audience didn't move. You could have heard a phone vibrate from 10 rows back. Trevor shifted this time noticeably. You're quoting something that was never meant for air, he said sharply. Out of context, illegally obtained, maybe even altered. This is a con. It's not journalism. It's character assassination. Karoline didn't blink. Then call it what you want. But the people watching deserve to hear what was said when the cameras weren't rolling. That's where the truth hides. Some in the audience clapped. Others sat stiff, unsure of who was in the right anymore. For a split second, it didn't feel like a political divide. It felt like a national moment of reckoning. Trevor leaned into the mic again, this time lower. I've done comedy for 15 years. I've mocked presidents, both parties, the system itself. But this is a staged ambush. Karoline, still composed, countered with precision. And what you said in that room, that wasn't comedy. It was strategy against a sitting president, cloaked in satire and funded behind the scenes. Now the debate was no longer between two public figures. It was between what the audience believed they knew and what might lie beneath the surface. Jack Harper, sensing a line was about to be crossed, posed the obvious question. Karoline, are you planning to play that video right now? She glanced at the control booth, then back to the crowd, then finally to the camera. I will, she said. But not yet. Because first I want Trevor to tell the American people why that clip exists at all, why satire became scripted. Trevor shook his head. Play your video, he said. Let's end this show trial. But the studio wasn't ready for an ending. It was leaning in for an eruption. And across millions of screens from New York to Nebraska, the same question rang out. What's really on that tape? The tension was unbearable. Karoline Leavitt had the remote in her hand, thumb poised over the button. The words, "I'll play it when the time's right," still echoed in the studio air like a lit fuse waiting to burn down. Trevor Noah sat still, jaw-tight, eyes locked on hers. Across the country, millions were leaning forward in their living rooms, holding their breath. And then everything changed. The screen behind them blinked. Once, then again. A low electronic flicker ran through the stage monitors. Suddenly, the entire feed went black. Dead air. At first, the audience inside the studio thought it was a tech glitch, but Karoline didn't move. Trevor's face stiffened. Jack Harper touched his earpiece, eyes narrowing. Something was off, and he knew it. A second later, his face tightened like a man receiving bad news in real time. He cleared his throat, forced a smile, and spoke into the mic with the forced calm of a seasoned broadcaster trying to land a plane through a storm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a temporary technical issue. Please stand by. But no one was buying it. Not in the studio, not at home. Because the lights were still on. The mics were still hot. The cameras were still rolling. The feed was cut, but not by accident. Upstairs in the control booth, chaos had erupted. Phones were ringing off the hook. One assistant shouted to another. It's coming from corporate New York. A studio director, white-knuckled and sweating, looked at a blinking red phone line and mouthed, It's the sponsor. They're pulling funding if we air it." The senior producer, a veteran of cable news wars, stood frozen, then barked the order, "Kill the feed. Now." Back on stage, Karoline stood still, slowly lowering the remote. She knew what had just happened. Everyone did, but no one dared to say it yet. Trevor let out a short breath, leaned back, and looked out over the audience with a half smile. Not triumphant, not smug, just tired. Jack removed his hand from the earpiece and broke the silence. "We've been asked to pause the broadcast," he said carefully, "due to unforeseen contractual complications." Karoline turned not to Jack, not to Trevor, but to the camera that was no longer broadcasting live. Her words were no longer for the network. They were for history. "This is what happens when power fears the truth," she said, low and direct. "They don't argue with it. They shut it off." The audience began to murmur, not with anger, but with realization. This wasn't just about a video anymore. This wasn't just Trevor versus Karoline. It was something larger. Something that had been happening for years but had just been caught in the spotlight. Someone somewhere still decides what the public is allowed to see. And tonight they decided you didn't need to see the rest. Outside the studio, social media exploded. #cut the feed and #truth. Interrupted started trending within minutes. Viewers were uploading their own recordings, blurry phone footage from inside the studio. The truth was out there, and it wasn't going quietly. Backstage, Jack pulled Karoline aside. "They're shutting us down," he said. "But the clip, is it real?" Karoline looked him dead in the eye. "Jack, it's as real as the silence you just heard." And with that, the battle wasn't over. It had just gone underground. They thought cutting the feed would kill the moment. It did the opposite. Within minutes of the blackout, shaky phone footage from inside the American Spotlight studio began flooding social media. Grainy, dim, and incomplete, but real. Enough to confirm what millions had sensed: something was being silenced. And just like that, the viewers weren't just watching history anymore. They were part of it. On X, formerly Twitter, hashtags began trending at breakneck speed. #unmute Karoline. Trevor set up. Spotlight censored. By the time the East Coast was finishing dinner, clips of Karoline holding the remote and the screen going black had been reposted over 300,000 times. On TikTok, creators stitched the footage with fiery commentary, some praising Karoline as a truth teller, others mocking the entire broadcast as political theater. But this wasn't just content anymore. It had become a cultural fault line. Conservative voices jumped in fast. Ben Shapiro posted a rapid-fire reaction, calling the incident a live, televised act of corporate censorship. In his words, Karoline Leavitt brought receipts. Instead of refuting them, the media pulled the plug. That's not journalism. That's protection. He wasn't alone. Dozens of right-leaning influencers, podcasters, and former Trump advisors rallied online, calling the moment proof that mainstream networks feared conservative voices when they came armed with facts, not just slogans. But the counterattack came just as quickly. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "The feed was pulled to stop a manipulated, out-of-context video. Don't fall for MAGA theatrics." This wasn't censorship, it was responsible broadcasting. MSNBC hosts called it a well-timed stunt, accusing Karoline of staging the moment for political gain. CNN brought on legal analysts, questioning the ethics and legality of airing leaked production room audio. Suddenly, every major outlet had an angle. Every podcast had a take. Late-night shows rushed to spin monologues. Jimmy Kimmel joked, "Well, at least it wasn't a balloon this time," while Greg Gutfeld called it the most honest 20 seconds on TV this year, right before the truth got cut. And in homes across America, especially among older viewers who had been glued to the screen since the broadcast began, A very different kind of conversation was brewing. In retirement communities, veterans' halls, local diners, and Facebook groups, people asked the question no one could cleanly answer. Why would they cut the feed if she was wrong? The uncertainty struck deep. Not because Karoline was universally trusted, not because Trevor was universally doubted, but because the silence itself had become louder than any accusation. The moment the network intervened, viewers, many of them raised in the post-Watergate era, felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't just a debate. This was a decision about what Americans should or shouldn't see. And that hit home. YouTube lit up with breakdowns, slow-motion replays, and side-by-side timelines of the exact moment. Trevor looked tense. Jack got the signal and Karoline reached for the button. Some videos called it the new Zapruder film for the digital age. But underneath all the drama, a deeper shift was underway. The audience had stopped being spectators. They'd become witnesses, interpreters, investigators. And the truth, it was no longer controlled by a studio. It was fighting for air on millions of screens, shared, argued, dissected. The battle for that one video clip had spilled beyond the spotlight, and now America itself had become the stage. The stage was dark now. The feed was long cut. The applause had faded. The hashtags were still raging online, but inside the people who had stood in the spotlight, Trevor, Noah, Karoline Leavitt, and even Jack Harper, something much quieter had taken root. Trevor sat alone in his Manhattan apartment. The city lights blinked outside his window, but his eyes stayed fixed on the glow of his TV screen, muted now, replaying coverage of the firestorm he had just walked through. Clips of Karoline freeze-framed mid-sentence. The moment the screen went black, the wave of fury and praise that followed. He rubbed his hands together, not out of cold, but out of unease. Had he done the right thing? Had walking off that stage preserved his integrity or betrayed it? He remembered what he said about truth and satire, about keeping audiences thinking without pushing them. But tonight made him wonder, was that still enough? He whispered the question he wasn't ready to ask out loud. Do the values I've defended still matter in a world that doesn't wait to listen? Across the country, in a modest office in Washington, D.C., Karoline Leavitt sat surrounded by staffers, scrolling headlines, cheering trending hashtags, printing out clips from conservative outlets praising her as the new face of truth. Someone brought in coffee. Someone else said a senator wanted to meet. But Karoline didn't join the celebration. She stared out the window, eyes distant. The video hadn't aired, but the reaction had exploded. Her name was everywhere. But instead of relief, she felt something else wait. I may have won this moment, she thought, but did I just step into something much bigger than I'm ready for? It wasn't a loss, but it didn't feel like a victory either. Back inside the now empty studio, Jack Harper stood alone in the spotlight long after the crew had left. He looked into the camera, now shut off, and muttered to no one in particular, "The truth. It's not always left or right. Sometimes it's just the thing nobody wants exposed." He had seen debates for decades, candidates, CEOs, whistleblowers, performers. But tonight was different. It wasn't just about who had the better argument. It was about something deeper, something dangerous. Who gets to define the truth, and who gets to decide when it's too much to share? And that question didn't end with the broadcast. Across living rooms in America, people in their 60s, 70s, and beyond sat quietly, perhaps next to their spouse, or with the TV muted, just thinking. They weren't asking who won or lost. They were asking themselves something older, something harder. Who do I trust? And have I trusted too easily? Because when a screen goes dark, it doesn't just hide the truth. It forces us to turn inward and look for it ourselves. Karoline and Trevor may have clashed. Networks may have panicked. The internet may have exploded. But the most important outcome didn't happen on stage. It happened in the minds of the people watching, where real truth either grows or gets buried. And this time, no one left untouched. In a world saturated with headlines, talking points, and viral clips, this story reminds us of something timeless. Truth isn't always loud, but it's always worth listening for. When the cameras cut and the noise fades, what remains is the responsibility of each individual to think critically, ask questions, and refuse to be spoon-fed one side of any story. For those of us who've lived through decades of political change, media evolution, and cultural shifts, this moment isn't new. It's familiar. We've seen truth buried under applause and exposed through whispers. What made this event powerful wasn't just the clash between Karoline and Trevor. It was the realization that sometimes truth gets silence. Not because it's false, but because it's inconvenient. And when that happens, the burden falls on us, the viewer, the citizen, the neighbor, to stay awake. So whether you're Team Karoline, Team Trevor, or just Team America, remember your voice still matters, your judgment still matters. And asking, "What are they not telling me?" is not cynicism, it's wisdom, earned over time. If this story made you pause, reflect, or rethink, leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel. And most of all, stay alert. We need your voice now more than ever.